The Incas, a rather small people who lived in the center of the Andes Mountains, had a rather interesting fate. They created the largest empire in pre-Columbian America with the best infrastructure, the best administration, the largest army, the highest level of technology, the most gold and silver, the coolest llamas, and so on. The fall of this empire at the hands of the conquistadors was also the most ridiculous. 168 conquistadors, smallpox and measles, that's pretty much the recipe for the fall of the Incas. But today I'm going to tell you a slightly different story. Welcome to the Synthetic History channel, where we talk about events that didn't happen as if they did. And today, using Europa Universalis IV with the mod MEIOU TAXES, I will tell you my story of how this empire was formed, what it was, and how it was able to survive the invasions of Europeans and adapt to the world that suddenly appeared before them, in the form of historical narrative. The rise and modernization of the Inca Empire in EU4. The Incas, of course, did not emerge from nothing. The civilizational process in the Andes began in the first millennium AD, and a large number of those technical achievements of the ancient Incas, which they are known for, were invented by their predecessors. The Incas themselves appeared on the political arena somewhere in the beginning of the 13th century. It will not be possible to say more precisely, the reason I will tell you later. Having moved from the area of Lake Titicaca to Cusco. According to the legend, they had 10 communities, EILUs, left one of such collapsed semi-states of predecessors, and founded in Cusco the city of the same name. The rulers of this new state were king's gods, who bore title Sapa Inca, literally translated as the only Inca, sort of limited by the council of the highest nobility. And this highest nobility were their relatives, Incas. From them went the trivial name of their future state. They were descendants of Manco Capac, the first Sapa Inca, and his sister wife Mama Uclu, who in turn were descendants of the gods. The practice of sister wives, by the way, became a tradition. Their promised land was fertile mountain valleys and plains. Sounds like an oxymoron, but it looked something like this. Looks pretty arable, you must agree. A century and a half, Incas gradually built up their power, constantly fighting in defensive wars for survival, in quotes, because we have information only from Inca sources, and there is not much trust in them, and expanded their zone of influence at the expense of surrounding tribes, somewhere by diplomacy and somewhere by war. And by the next century, they created a state approximately equal in strength to their neighbors. By the second half of the 14th century, the population of the state was about 500,000 people, which was quite a lot. At the time, Inca Roca, the Magnanimous, established himself as the head of the state, and under him the meaning of wars, or rather their justification, finally changed. If before they were kind of wars for survival, now they were outright wars for expansion and spread of the only true religion, about which I will tell you later. The first such war was the war against the Quispicanchi. The difference in strength was too great, and the latter surrendered after a brief siege. The next target of the Incas were their longtime rivals, the Confederacy of Chanca tribes, who were among those with whom the very wars for survival were waged. There was obviously no question of surrender. The opposing armies met in the battle on the territory of the Chanca, and they lost the battle, according to the Incas, thanks to the ambush they had set up. Inca armies were usually commanded by Incas, in the sense of relatives of the ruler. The rulers themselves rarely went to war. After one more battle, the Chanca army was finally defeated, and their lands were left defenseless. But Inca Roca was not in vain nicknamed Magnanimous, and forbade the army to plunder the local population, though there was pretty much nothing to plunder there. Chanca hardly had any cities. As a result of the war, the Incas conquered most of their lands. Thus, they became the strongest force in the Andes, at least in their southern half. Consequently, defensive alliances began to form against them. And, of course, king's gods and nobility of relatives at their level of technological and social development would not surprise anyone, although the Incas had their own features that gave them an advantage. The most important of these was the Inca army, known for its quality? Actually, Inca army and quality are antonyms. So if the mod developers are watching this video, change Cusco ideas to quantity. It will be more historical. And I'll let myself change them manually, while no one sees. Known for its quantity, tens of thousands of soldiers, even at that time. It owed this to its system of labor duties, MEIOU, which in the Inca state was used instead of taxes. I will tell about it now, because it was the base on which the future empire was built and before the arrival of Europeans stood. Every year, practically all men aged from 15 to 50 years had to work for the state for a certain number of days. Usually it was about 3 months. There were many forms of labor. From cultivation of the fields of the sovereign and nobility, the state fields made up about a third of the arable land, to work in mines and construction of roads and warehouses. Usually, if a person had some special skills, he practiced his duty by means of them. Blacksmiths forged, Incas were skilled in bronze processing. Weavers created gorgeous fabric from alpaca fiber, craftsmen created all sorts of pots for the state, while dancers danced, and this is not a joke. And one of the forms of MEIOU was seasonal military service. The state in turn provided the soldiers with everything they needed, from food and water to equipment. But equipment was usually limited to clubs, maces and axes with stone and bronze tops and short spears, wooden helmets and shields, quilted tunics and slingshots as long-range weapons. There were enough stones for projectiles in the mountains. So as you can understand, the quality of such an army of seasonally conscripted peasants left much to be desired. However, it more than compensated for this with its huge numbers, several times larger than its neighbors. And wars happened so often that a conscript had a good chance to fight several times in his life. Moreover, as a result of continuous defensive wars, the Incas formed a militaristic culture. The coolest warrior was considered Sapa Inca, although he did not fight. The soldiers were respected, and the war itself was perceived as a holiday, because the state provided the soldiers with good food and arranged festivals on this occasion. Even the symbol of power among the Incas was a weapon, a halberd. Only the highest nobility wielded them. At the same time, Inca militarism differed from, for example, the Mesoamerican. If for the latter, the main thing was to kill more people, spill more blood and take more prisoners for sacrifices, for the former it was important to win. Therefore, the Incas' strategy was simple: to frighten the opponents with the size of their army and force them to surrender. And the fact that this army of yesterday's and tomorrow's peasants did not fight very well, no one suspected. The quality of armies in the region in general was not good. In addition, the Incas before the attack 3 times sent their ambassadors with gifts and requests to surrender. And if they surrendered, such as Quispicanchi, the Incas treated them quite well. The lands were not taken from the elites, just integrated the population into the MEIOU system. But if they had to fight, as with Chanca, the defeated had a not very enviable fate. Some of the local nobles were put under the knife. Sapa Inca walked over their lying corpses in front of the rest of the nobility, who looked at such a spectacle and were charged with loyalty. And their children remained in Cusco to learn Inca customs and Quechua language, the future lingua franca of the empire. Pretty magnanimous, I'd say. The corpses, by the way, were not thrown away. They were used to make flutes from bones, cups from skulls, drums from leather, and so on. The next target of the Incas were Cola, a state south of Cusco, who made an alliance with the remnants of Chanca, which was the reason for the war. So first, they finished the latter, and then switched to the former, who were just coming to their aid, defeated them, and then chased them as far as Pocasa and back. The war ended with the complete destruction of the Chanca, the sacking of the capital Cola, the conquest of Cana, and the repayment of a large contribution. This was the end of Inca Roca's conquests, for in about 1380 he died, and his son Yavar Bakak ascended the throne. It's a good time to talk about the Inca succession system. And it's not that there was one. Power was supposed to pass from father to son, born of a sister wife, chosen by the ruler and recognized by the council. And in the matter of Yavar Bakak, this was the case. However, this scheme worked about half the time. In the other half, in the course of a intrigue or civil war, the throne passed to other sons from other wives, or to relatives. For obvious reasons, this was bad. A stable system of power was better than an unstable one. But on the other hand, it meant that competent rulers were in power. Because if you were recognized by the Inca Council, you were a decent guy. There seemed to be no puppet sovereigns. Inca Roca, for example, was probably such a usurper, because he founded a new dynasty Hanan, translated from Quechua as Upper Dynasty, and the previous dynasty was, or became, the Lower. He also made up the title Sapa Inca, and attributed all the previous rulers to it. They used to carry the title Capac, so I fooled you a bit at the beginning. Another problem that pops up from this is that the Incas were quite fond of rewriting history, and attributing to themselves the achievements of their predecessors. This was due to the Incas' perception of time. Despite having two types of calendars, solar and lunar, they did not have a linear chronology. Anything earlier than 6 years ago was called New Papacha, elapsed time. 10 years or 100 years, it doesn't matter, New Papacha. Manipulating history in such environment becomes much easier, and it becomes much more difficult to understand when exactly the Incas appeared at all. That's why the credibility of Inca sources is pretty low. There was another reason, but more on that later. Yavar Vakak began his reign with a new war. Having made an alliance with Ichma, which later became an autonomy, the Incas attacked Nazca, quite possibly the descendants of those who made these Nazca lines. Not yet showing much interest in the coastal deserts lowlands, the Incas conquered only lands in the Andes. Then followed a whole series of wars against Cola and the rest of the Aymara kingdoms, polities formed after the fall of Tiwanaku state, the very one from which the Incas came. It is not very clear who the Incas were in this state, quite possibly some influential clan, but in any case they used it as an excuse to unify the region. Wars continued under the next ruler, Tupac Amaru, and his successor, Tupac Hualpa, and the Inca armies moved further and further south from their heartland. The question arises, how did they supply these huge armies? The answer is the Inca system of logistics. Capturing new lands, the Incas integrated them into the Mita system, and took from the local population a part of the fields that they had to cultivate as a labor duty. The crops harvested from these lands and the stuff made here did not go to Cusco, but to a local warehouse next to the road, one a day's walk away from another. And all of these also were built on Mita's orders. Stocks from these warehouses were used to supply the army by means of caravans of llamas. Wagons would be of little use in the mountains. And also to feed the Mita workers, sick, widows, and as a reserve in case of droughts. Thus, the Incas had a reliable source of food for their troops, without creating an unplanned burden on the local population. Even more, Inca soldiers were forbidden to take or accept food and water from the locals. And so, by the 1410s, Incas had already formed the strongest state in the Andes. The only strong rival was the kingdom of Chimor, which occupied the northern coastal territories. And with the expansion of the state appeared the problem of management and administration, because it became not so easy to send messengers with orders from Cusco. To solve this problem, all lands were divided into provinces. Each province had an administrative center with its own large warehouse, and the governor from the ethnic Incas. The governor had quite a bit of freedom in determining the assignment of Mita, meaning he managed the allocation of available labor. Also, the Inca army began to be augmented with auxiliaries from other nations. There were archers and all sorts of badass warriors from warlike tribes. A motley mass, in a word. In the 1430s, the Incas shifted the focus of expansion to the northwest, defeating the Nazca and launching a series of wars against the Chimor and their allies. There was even a reason. This time it was religion. It's time to briefly talk about it. Incas were pagans. I think it will not surprise anyone. They had a lot of gods, and they, just like the Romans, included in their pantheon the gods of the conquered peoples. In general, in the course of the story, it was and will be possible to notice a lot of similarities between Incas and Romans, and also Chinese, so you can write about those that you noticed in the comments. The main gods of the Incas were three. Viracocha, the creator of the universe and the most popular god because he existed before the Incas and was worshipped by most peoples of the Andes. Inti, the god of the sun and men, and partly the main face of the Incan expansion. because it was the worship of him that was planted to the conquered peoples, and his sister wife, Mama Kila, the goddess of the moon and women. One immediately senses the importance of dualism in the religion and culture of the Andean peoples. Sun and moon, day and night, man and woman, earth and cosmos, life and death. All these things were connected and flowed into each other. From this was born such a seemingly strange idea of the Incas about the cyclical nature of time, as well as their fascination with mummies and statues, which were their representatives in the world of the living, the veneration of ancestors and child sacrifices. After all, life did not end at death. They even had their own version of the yin and yang symbol, chacana. At the same time, it was possible that there is no equality between the dual forces. There is more life on Earth than in space, for example. And here we come to the important part. The Incas considered Inti to be more powerful god than Mama Kila, but the Chanca thought the opposite. The moon was really quite important to the inhabitants of coastal lands, tides for example. And where can one settle such a dispute but on the battlefield? The Incas apparently won that dispute, and the Inti won it with them. As it says, are the Incas worshipping you because you are the strongest, or does being worshipped by the Incas make you the strongest? During these wars, the Inca state was finally transformed into an empire, with all the hallmarks of an empire. There was no solemn ceremony of the founding of the empire, just that 1450 is considered the beginning of the imperial transition. The Incas themselves called their state Tawantinsuyu, realm of the four parts. The four corners of these quarters met at the center, Cusco, and had their own viceroy. This system soon enough, under the next ruler Tupac Amaru II, turned into a decorative system. Viceroys lost almost all power, and the provinces finally became the main administrative subjects. In general, this emperor did and invented a lot of things, simply because he ruled for more than 50 years. His main achievement was the creation of a stable system of middle and lower levels of government. Under him, the cities and communities of the empire acquired magistrates from local peoples, appointed through recommendations, who had judicial, religious and executive powers. From this point on, a separate class of bureaucrats began to rise in the imperial system of government. These guys owed everything to the empire. The empire paid them salaries. The empire gave them power. Without the empire, they would turn into mere collaborators in the eyes of their peoples, because nobody likes a tax collector. And so they had more loyalty to it than the nobility, and were safer for the power of the emperors than the greater nobility. At the same time, unlike provincial governors, there were quite a lot of them. If the first at that time was no more than 100, the latter were under 10,000, and there were also officials of smaller ranks. Therefore, bureaucrats began to gradually replace the nobles and priests, although at first they were the same people. The bureaucratic hierarchy became the main support of Inca's power. This was facilitated by the fact that hierarchical nature was initially sewn into the core of Indian society, long before the Incas emerged. Take for instance the age of a person. Due to the fact that time was perceived not as a line but as a cycle, people did not attach much importance to age. Some of them probably knew how many winters had passed since their birth, but for most of them it was not important. Instead of age, there were ranks, 10 basic ones for men and women, and a few localized ones for different communities. Ranks meant your competence in different matters, gave rights and duties, and the Incas used them to determine mita. A man could remain a helper of a helper all his life, and in his old age he could move to the rank of a wise grandfather. So meritocracy was justified by itself, but more on that later. The Tupac Amaru also created a regular imperial guard, composed of volunteers from the minor nobility of local Quechua peoples, but also distinguished soldiers from other peoples could join in. This guard was engaged in rather harsh suppression of uprisings of these other peoples. The conscription army also changed. Instead of conscription for a season, there was now conscription for 4 years. And for both armies, a system of military hierarchy was established, based on a unit of 10 soldiers, and the organization scale was a factor of 5 and then of 2. 10, 50, 100, 500 and so on. By the way, the Inca duality was present here as well. Two units of the same size were grouped. For example, 50 men were united into 100, and they and their officers competed with each other for awards and promotions. Those who distinguished themselves in military and civil service could even become Incas by merit. Classic carrot and stick policy. The Incas were also fond of moving huge masses of people. It was about hundreds of thousands. Such forced migrations served two purposes. The first was assimilation of unruly peoples. The displaced population was forced to communicate in one way or another with their new neighbors, and they communicated in Quechua. The second objective was colonization outside and inside the empire. And if with the first one everything is clear, the Incas expanded their empire at the expense of surrounding tribes, thus reaching more or less natural borders by the 1480s. Then the last one should be explained in more detail. The point is that mountain valleys were places though fertile, but rather unsafe. It was possible to attack this valley from any direction, and the locals could not notice the attackers until the moment of meeting. Therefore, such valleys often remained unpopulated and undeveloped. With the unification of the region under rule of one empire, such fears disappeared, and the Incas began to resettle other peoples there. Thus, Quechua became the lingua franca of the empire, and the population was gradually assimilated. And the population itself, with the development of new lands, construction of irrigation facilities and terraces, was constantly growing. Peace in general released a large amount of labor force directed to the construction of cities with sewers, aqueducts and roads. The latter in the mountains were carved tens of thousands of kilometers. In many ways the figure was so large because they were ornate and narrow. Incas had not rode animals and carts. And Cusco, for example, by the beginning of the 16th century became the largest city in the empire, with a population of about 150,000 people, ceasing to be just an administrative center. That's when Titu Cusi Yupanqui became the ruler, and he continued his predecessor's work of reformation of the empire. I would even say he was more successful at it. Under his reign, the system of provinces and districts was reorganized, and their boundaries were drawn in such a way as to divide the peoples living there into parts, if possible. This was done for their more effective assimilation. The system of control over the implementation of Mita was reorganized, the judicial system was expanded, this branch of power was placed under the control of the courts, which were guided by the later created Universal Code of Laws, which meant that everyone was equal before the law, from the Incas to the fishermen from the coast. Speaking of fishermen from the coast, from the 1510s to the Incas began to get rumors about some strange white people from the north, as it turned out later, the English. These at the time no names even managed to conquer the local Muisca culture, to which the Incas then had too far to go. Over time, their expeditions of up to 100 people began to reach the borders of the empire, but they ran into strong defenses and at best returned with a few captives, or did not return. But these guys brought something worse than crossbows, harquebuses or swords. They brought diseases, in particular smallpox. And the Incas were lucky that they got a rather light strain, with a lethality of about 15%, and the empire was not badly affected by it. And it is interesting that in 1470s, on the lands of Inca there was a disease, by symptoms resembling smallpox, and its center was the ocean coast. However, there is a logical question. How could smallpox get there 50 years before the arrival of Europeans? There are three possibilities. The most probable one is that it is just an error of interpretation and translation of records, because the Incan writing system was… I will tell you about it later. The second one is that the pathogen was on a Chinese junk. These are such big ships. Under the Zhou Empire they were exploring Indonesia at the time. One of these ships could have gotten caught in a storm, gone of course, and its remains could have landed on the shores of the empire. But the smallpox agent lives in the external environment no more than a few days, so on these wrecks must have remained people, and there was nothing about unusual people in Inca records. So this option is the least likely. The third, that the spawning of the disease was attributed to the fact of colonization of the surrounding lands, which becomes available only on 34 admin tech. So when I colonized it with a console command for a pretty border, it spawned. Also a very likely scenario. And in 1528, the English also appeared on this coast, establishing their colony here. The population of the empire after the epidemic then amounted to about 12 million people. Quite a lot. And this event for the Incas was probably the most shocking. It could not even be thought that the sea could be used to move large numbers of people over great distances. The Incas themselves had at best boats at their disposal. The colony itself did not cause great discontent among the Incas. The power of the Inca there was rather weak, and the profits these lands practically did not bring. You cannot send fishermen from the lowlands to work in the mountains. The climate is not suitable. But still, the emperor was interested to know what kind of aliens they were, and therefore he invited their representatives to Cusco. The English took with them the captives taken earlier, who had learned English and were useful as interpreters. Both sides were surprised that they were in contact with the same state in the north and in the south. Perhaps even more surprising to the British was the wealth of the empire, and more specifically the amount of gold and silver. For the Incas, these metals were primarily of religious value, because they also represented duality. Gold is the sun and joy, silver is the moon and sadness. For the English, however, these metals represented a completely different value, not yet understood by the Incas. So they in turn were surprised at the English obsession with these shiny things. Pretty soon they would realize what money was, and change their minds. But at that point, both sides considered each other barbarians. Culture differences, however, did not prevent the establishment of something like an English embassy in Cusco. How that embassy was used is another matter. The English expectedly began preparations for a major expedition against the Incas, and used this embassy to gather information. Therefore, when in 1533 Titu Cusi Yupanqui died, and his son Atahualpa took his place, and the state was in the usual turmoil, they provoked a scandal related to religion, closed the embassy and left. At the same time, their army was to launch an attack on Cusco from the north. At least that was the plan. But there were two problems. Moving tens of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic was a super complicated logistical task at the time, so it dragged on for 2 years. And Titu Cusi Yupanqui was not a fool. Even on the contrary, as soon as it began clear that the whites from the south and the whites from the north were the same people, he began preparations for war, having previously informed the heir and the Incas. And when the scandal occurred, Atahualpa detained the ambassadors and had them all executed. Bit cruel, but fair. Then the Inca army itself went on the offensive and raided the colonies of the English, destroying their food supplies. And by the time their army arrived, they had already gone back and prepared for defense. This, however, did not help them much. 120,000 Inca army was defeated by 16,000 English one. It became obvious to the Incas that something had to change. The main problem for them was not cannons and arquebuses, but cavalry. And it is understandable, they had not yet invented ways to fight it. But a few more such defeats gave them the experience they needed, and they came up with an answer pretty quickly. The horseman himself is a rather vulnerable target, and cavalry is a threat only in a large strike group. And therefore the main strategy was guerrilla warfare, aimed at exhausting the enemy forces with small skirmishes, before the general battle. In the battle itself, it is necessary to use a dense formation with long spears, or halberds, so that the cavalry could not trample soldiers unpunished. So the Incas invented the phalanx. And these changes helped. They began to win more battles than they lost. The last major battle took place in December 1533, almost in the same place as the first. But this time it ended in a crushing defeat for the English and their retreat. They did not return again. Their resources were exhausted. Nevertheless, a formal peace was not concluded until 6 years later. According to this peace treaty, the English were only allowed to have the port of Camana, the very first settlement they founded and where they traded with them, plus the payment of symbolic compensation. By that time, Incas learned about the existence of two more European states, Spain and Portugal, and quickly realized that these guys were no different from each other. All of them wanted to conquer their country, and all of them wanted to take more shiny things. Incas, as in the good old days, again had to fight wars for survival. and they will drag on for a whole century, and will be accompanied by consistent changes of power dynamic. But I think you will notice it yourself. At that, it was certainly easier for them to survive than for all other Indians. First of all, I mean the Indians of Mesoamerica, who were on approximately equal level of social development with the Incas. There were several reasons. Geographical, it was more difficult to get to the Incas. Technological, the Incas were a society that knew blacksmithing, and it was much easier to move from bronze processing to the creation of cannons than to move to the latter from stone processing, even if the stone was volcanicless. And state. The Incas were a single empire with a huge mobilization resource, and Mesoamerica was a bunch of tribes and kingdoms. This treaty also initiated honest diplomatic relations with the Europeans, which I would characterize as marriage to a rich abuser, who yet loves your joint child and you can't get away with divorcing them because your country has bribed judges. The child here is trade. As much as Europeans would have liked to get all Inca gold and silver for free, something is clearly better than nothing. And in exchange for these metals, they assisted the Incas in westernizing, or rather, to put it more accurately, easternizing the Inca state and society. But let's talk about everything in order. What was most interesting and important to the Incas? Weapons, obviously. Even during the war, they were able to get as war trophies all sorts of swords, crossbows, helmets, breastplates, cannons, and recognize their effectiveness. So to fight the Europeans, you had to get more of their weapons. And obviously they had to learn to produce them themselves. The latter sold weapons very reluctantly, and at a high margin. The captives taken after the battles informed the Incas about the principles of firearms, and told them that the metal from which the equipment was made was called iron. And this iron ore had to be found, processed, and made into the needed stuff. And it was impossible to do without specialists, and they could be obtained only in Europe and their colonies. About other countries at the time Incas didn't know. So they spread a rumor in Camana that they would hire European specialists versed in metallurgy, engineering and other sciences for a generous reward. The rumors reached Europe, and Europe was just finishing the Renaissance. And there were plenty of these Renaissance people, or polymaths. People versed in all spheres of science and life, from music to economics, and they sailed to South America for easy money. Then went mostly people from Germany and Italy, less from Scandinavia and France. With it, by the way, the Incas would later have the warmest relations. To receive the ships of Europeans, city of Pachamac was equipped with a harbor and something like a university, so that Europeans mostly did not have to go to the mountains. The number of people willing to go south to work increased under the new Inca, Coilas. While still a prince, he became fascinated with the alien religion, and when he became emperor, he converted to Christianity. The choice fell on Protestantism. Incas did not want to recognize the religious power of some other Europeans. And if some Jesuit had learned what the Incas then called Christianity, the main difference from the Inca religion in which was the renaming of Viracocha as God, and that no one really was going to spread Christianity, he would have been shocked, to say the least. But hey, they had their own vision. And at least the Coilas forbade human sacrifices, polygamy, and adopted European chronology. They didn't have their own, as I said. Anyway, the Europeans were attracted by the very fact of adoption of Christianity, so it was a workable idea. By the next war, against the English and also the Portuguese, they had already started to establish production of their steel. Luckily, they had iron deposits in the Andes. But in this war, they did not need steel, because it was as strange as possible. The Spaniards colonized the lands on the road used by the English in the last war, and refused to let them pass. And those were afraid to provoke their enemies to a possible war in Europe. It was also impossible to transport troops through the straits in the south, so only the Portuguese had ability to fight. Then the Spaniards themselves attacked the Incas, but now themselves could not agree with the English, and transporting troops through the straits in the south was again impossible. However, iron found many other uses. First of all, iron tools. Take stone masonry, for example. Ancient Inca buildings are known for the use of polygonal masonry, made of polygonal stones butted against each other, jointed at arbitrary angles. They were made by hewing a stone of lower hardness with a stone of higher one. There are a lot of stones of different rocks in the mountains. Literally you go out of the house and already see stones. And man-hours for labor on selection and fitting of suitable stones were not spared. Iron changed the state of affairs. Processing became easier and it became more profitable to make stone blocks of the same size and shape, which was probably influenced by European advisors. The first major structure built using European technology was the capital in Cusco, the new center of the imperial bureaucracy. Such a center was needed to introduce a unified tax system that replaced the mita. So why abolish such a cool system and replace it with the soulless taxes? The answer lay in trade, or rather in commercial activity. Europeans brought with them the idea of commerce, and brought goods that the Incas were willing to buy. Spices, porcelain and silk from Asia, transported across the Pacific Ocean. And also ivory. And well, gold and silver was available not only to the Incas, but also to the simpler people, and for the exchange between them needed intermediaries, traders. However, there were no traders in the empire, they were replaced by mita, which was practiced by peasants and artisans. And it acted as a kind of redistribution system in the country, just like in a planned economy. You work for the state, and it gives you the goods you need. There were exchanges between people, of course, but it was a natural exchange. There was too much gold and silver to be valuable as money, and there was no need for it. But now there was a bottomless market for these metals, the rest of the world. And since there were no restrictions on trade as such, traders appeared by themselves and got good money from it, which bypassed the state. The state did not want to put up with it, but it was not going to strangle the new formed social class with the state monopoly. Therefore, mita was replaced by taxes. Gold and silver coins began to be minted, most of the state lands were distributed to the peasantry, a commercial code appeared, and all this was done according to the best European models. So the Inca Empire can be considered the first state in history to make the transition from a planned economy to capitalism. Progress or regress? Anyway, at the end of these wars, Inca conquered from the Europeans almost the entire west coast. The Spaniards, for example, no longer appeared in South America, and achieved the conduct of trade through their harbors, which by that time were built quite a lot. And as it turned out, transportation by sea was much more cost-effective than land transportation, so it began to become a priority, and the most developed route was the route from Cusco to the nearest port in Ica. That's when the Incas began to make progress in providing their soldiers with steel equipment, and training them to European standards. Last century standards, but still. This in turn gave the Incas the opportunity to begin a new phase of colonization, but this time it was much larger. Expansion was all along the border, thanks to the colonial frontier system, under which settlers were given free land to farm on the principle of whoever cultivates it, owns it. The Incas treated the local population better than the Europeans. They had no slavery, so they persuaded them with gifts and threats to adopt an agrarian way of life, which worked after a while. And if it didn't work, they were forcibly relocated to already settled areas of the empire. A continuation of the good old imperial assimilation program. Colonization was not only conventionally peaceful, however. Those who resisted were killed. Disadvantage of the absence of the institution of slavery. For example, against the Mapuche people, who successfully fought against the Portuguese, the Incas themselves started a colonial war and subdued them, but not completely. The Mapuche continued guerrilla struggle for a long time, and they were subdued only by the 18th century. The English, meanwhile, continued their struggle for Inca wealth, and in 1584 began a new war. It was the first large-scale war between the Incas, the Portuguese and the English. The latter had reached the level of logistics to move large armies without much trouble, and the former had mastered their technology to an acceptable level. So both sides had major victories and defeats. But I am more interested not in the fighting, but in the fact that during this war there was a really important event. The opening of the first printing house in Cusco. Generally, it was a really significant event, because it greatly simplified the spread of knowledge, but I guess you already understand that. For the Incas, it had its own unique significance, though. So this is a good time to talk about the Inca script. And frankly, I haven't talked about it before for comic effect. Well, here it is. This thing is called a quipu, and it was the Inca equivalent of writing. Information was encoded using knots, depending on the color of the thread and the type of warp: corn cob, wood, copper, gold, and so on. As you can understand, this thing was, to put it mildly, rather inconvenient. Imagine, for example, a tax return made of such knots. So those who knew how to use it could already be said to be a representative of the intelligentsia, and the whole imperial bureaucracy was kept on it. That was at least until the Europeans arrived. When they saw the quipu, they were probably as shocked as we are, and advised the emperor to switch to normal writing. You know, paper, ink, pen, these things. The emperor listened. The transcription of the Quechua into Latin alphabet began. It made little sense to invent their own from scratch in this case. And the final version looked like this: 28 letters, of which only 3 vowels. However, the complete transition from quipu to the new writing system was hindered by the very Incas who knew quipu, and specifically by bureaucracy, because the others had a lot of work to transcribe the information from quipu to paper. So for some time, these two systems coexisted. But the printing press was the last blow for quipu, and for the next century, they virtually disappeared. But back to the war. By 1592, the forces of the English and the Incas were exhausted. Total losses reached 150,000 people. And the only thing that led the Incas to victory then was the endless flow of people into the army, overwhelmed with numbers, so to speak. Under the peace treaty, the Incas took over some of the English and Portuguese colonies. Now they definitely controlled the entire west coast. Moreover, they got a small piece of the Atlantic coast, and began to build ports and transshipment points to facilitate trade with Europeans. The latter, in addition to Inca silver, were interested in potatoes, tobacco, and clothes made of alpaca fiber. These ports didn't come in much use, but more on that later. More importantly, trade and the seizure of European colonies gave the Incas access to the entire world's variety of domesticated animals and crops, from horses, dogs and chickens to grapes, olives and garlic. And in this respect, they can generally be called the greatest beneficiaries of the Columbian exchange. Horses, though little used in the military, performed well as draft animals outside of the mountains. New crops and animals were useful in colonization. For example, in the tropics rice proved itself well, and on the southern plains it was profitable to arrange pastures for sheep and cows. In general, people have always loved to eat good food, and more ingredients meant a wider scope of cooking. Although potatoes remained the main source of carbohydrates. Well, it is not surprising. Potatoes were the biggest crop. Back to politics. In 1608, Coelas died, another ruler who had ruled for 50 years. His son Quispetitu came to the throne, but he died 6 years later without having done anything much. The next ruler was his son Pachacutec. Before and during his reign in the empire for a long time came peace. First of all, it was due to the fact that the English realized that the war with the Incas is not profitable, and their riches cannot be taken away by force. But time passed, the Incas continued their expansion to the east, and bam! They encountered Portuguese colonies. By that time, they had already learned that they were on a continent separate from Europeans, and on this continent lived people similar to them. More backward, of course, but still similar. Definitely more similar than the Europeans. And a good half of the continent was colonized by the latter, subjugating this local population. So the Incas came up with the idea of attacking the Europeans themselves, taking their colonies and controlling the whole continent. It was a pretty natural idea, especially given the Incas' past and their struggle for survival in the last century. It was called Chahuaparak Anti, literally to reach the east. There were enough forces to realize this plan. The regular army reached the size of more than 100,000, and all of it was armed and trained according to European standards. 40 years old, but still. The population of the empire at the time was 22 million. I know you like those statistics. The war started in 1637, without its declaration, which was done at Pachacutec's wish. It was a reference to the First Inca-English War. And this war was already comparable in bloodiness to the European wars. The total losses reached 300,000. But it did not become so immediately. In March, Inca troops began an invasion along the entire border, and without much trouble occupied a significant part of the colonies of the English and Portuguese, encountering resistance only from the colonial troops. The Incas were lucky. They attacked when the armies of both countries were engaged in colonial warfare in West Africa, and therefore up to 1840s there were no major battles. But the British did move a huge contingent to Brazil, and the balance of power was equalized. And the main battle at Mato Grosso took place only in 1643, and the Incas won it, with difficulty. The war probably could continue for another 5 years, but in the Inca Empire began a rebellion of the nobility, and it was ethnic Inca nobility, and they had to send troops to suppress it. The rebellion itself had been brewing for quite a long time, and was caused by the reaction to the consistent policy of the state to reduce the role of the higher nobility. The emergence of a system of state examinations for positions in the bureaucracy, the opening of the post of governors and generals for non-ethnic Incas, the complete exemption of peasants from duties, the reduction of noble privileges, and so on. A reaction to the advance of meritocracy, to summarize. And as it turned out, a failed one. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, and the property of the rebels became the property of the state. The English didn't know about the rebellion, so the result of that battle determined the outcome of the war in 1644. The Incas gained huge territories along the entire line of border, and they certainly did not intend to stop there. 10 years later, already under the new Inca Tupac Amaru, they began a new war, this time a declared one. The Inca ambassador in the capital of the English colonial administration in Colombia gave them an ultimatum with the condition of surrendering all English colonies in South America. The demands were large, but had a basis, because it was becoming unprofitable for England to keep these colonies. Wars with the Incas took away too much manpower and material resources, compared to the revenues from the colonies. But it would have been humiliating to accept the ultimatum just like that. So they left only colonial troops there, instructing them to use scorched earth tactics and guerrilla warfare, depleting the Inca forces while terrorizing their coasts and merchant ships. By 1657, the Incas were still able to occupy all of South America, but the English and Portuguese continued to hold dominance at sea. Thus, these lands still had an undefined status, and so it would have continued, but the Incas by the time had acquired a good fleet, and therefore began to go beyond the continent. Firstly, they occupied the Isthmus of Panama, and then plundered the capital of the English colonial administration of the Caribbean islands. As a result, the Europeans lost impunity at sea, and agreed to peace with the recognition of the transition to the Incas part of the colonies. Most notable was the transfer of the Isthmus of Panama, and with it the interoceanic infrastructure, so the ports built by the Incas became of little use. A few centuries later, the Incas would build the Cachapura Canal there, but that's another story. In the European colonies, first of all in the Portuguese colonies, at the time there was a period of anarchy. It was already clear that the Incas would seize these lands, and there was no point in fighting for them. Perhaps it would have been reasonable to sell these lands to the Incas, but no one initiated such a deal out of spite. Soon, in 1676, the Incas began another war, namely against Portugal and Spain, and then, 5 years later, against England. The course of these wars was essentially the same as the previous one, only the Inca fleet became bigger and they became more brazen because of it. They raided Cuba and Mexico and put an end to the European presence on the continent. Well, Europeans, of course, remained in the empire, both as inhabitants of the captured territories and as invited intellectuals. But the latter, by the way, became less. And now I will tell you why. The reason is quite simple. The Incas themselves began to produce such smarties. They quickly realized that relying on foreigners in achievement progress is unreliable, and therefore began to create their own universities, which performed two tasks at once: training bureaucrats and creating their own scientific base. And it can be said that they succeeded. In 1701, they even founded their own Academy of Sciences. And from that time, Inca scientists and inventors began to make achievements independent of Europeans. Among the earliest is the improvement of the plow design and the invention of the flying shuttle loom. So because of the competition that emerged, payments to European scientists were decreasing, and it became unprofitable for them to work there. However, I wouldn't say that European influence decreased. In some ways, it even increased, primarily in religion. By absorbing the European colonies, the Incas had on top of them a huge number of Catholics, who did not react well to the power of the paganism, which was largely what the Inca religion remained, and therefore constantly revolted. There was also a local animist population, whose religion was poorly molded with Inca Christianity, and they, too, were constantly revolting. Neither ours nor yours, in short. Therefore, Incas increased the degree of Christianization. At the time, their official religion turned into a relatively decent direction of Protestantism, and the population of the east of the empire was forcibly converted to this religion. Because of this, legitimacy from the change of religions did not shake much. The transition itself was quite mild, and for the Incas not even necessary. Also, Incas after this war captured several coastal islands in the Atlantic Ocean. The English tried to reclaim them, and ended up losing the Galapagos Islands as well. Not very pleasantly. The Europeans made no further claims on South America, and they already had plenty to do elsewhere. The 18th century came, the century of the beginning of the domination of European imperialism, when Europeans began to actively terrorize not only the New World, but also the rest of the world, caused first by sheer technological advantage, and then by the Industrial Revolution. And the Incas managed to jump into this train of progress. And moreover, not in the last carriage, but we can even say that in one of the first. Cusco for a while became the largest city in the world with a population of 570,000. The reason was primarily due to the Chinese interregnum, but it was still a significant achievement. The population of the empire was somewhere around 37 million at the time, and of that, the Incas were somewhere around 1/5 of it. Pretty good compared to what it was a couple centuries earlier. So the Inca assimilation program was working well, and with the expansion of cities serving as a melting pot, it began to work even better. And it had to continue to work, because many people were still dissatisfied with the imperial power, especially in the east. But whether it was good or bad is another question. The empire itself assimilated into the European world, for the sake of modernization, sacrificing part of its religion and culture. And here the answer to the previously posed question is even more complicated. And then there was a question of revenge. Having conquered the whole continent, the Incas began to look to the north, and they had the idea of further conquest of both Americas. But what happened to the Incas and their empire next is material for another story. And this one ends here. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this, watch my other videos if you are new here, and don't forget about likes and comments. And with that, I bid you farewell.